Welcome, new and old friends. I just have a couple things to say, and then the stories will begin. Before you drift off into the dream realm, please remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment. If you'd like to find out about my social links, my website, how to help the channel, check the description box. Now turn off your lights, make sure your doors and windows are locked. It's time to dream. I found an old family journal about the Black Plague. I should have kept it closed. By SocietysMenaceCC. I never expected to find anything of significance while clearing out my great-aunt Theodore's house in Yorkshire. The elderly woman had lived alone for decades in the sprawling Victorian mansion, and after her passing at the age of 94, the task of sorting through her belongings fell to me. Most of her possessions were exactly what you expected. Dusty furniture, outdated clothes, and boxes after boxes of faded photographs. But in the attic, buried beneath a stack of molding blankets, I found something extraordinary. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was unmarked save for a single name written in flowing script. Aldridge Blackwood, 1665. My hands trembled as I opened it. Albert Blackwood had been a distant ancestor, a physician who lived through the Great Plague of London. I'd heard stories about him growing up, but I never knew any personal accounts that survived. The pages were remarkably well preserved, though the ink had faded to a rusty brown in places. As I began to read, I realized with a growing unease that this was no ordinary physician's diary. 12th of May, 1665. Today I witnessed something that defies all medical knowledge I possess. The plague has begun to spread through London Street, as we all feared it would. But there is something different about this outbreak, something that fills me with a deep and gnawing dread. I was called to attend young Thomas Whitemore, son of the merchant on Bread Street. The boy presented with the typical symptoms: fever, chills, and a small swelling in his neck. But when I examined the bubble more closely, I observed movement beneath the skin, not the usual pulsing of infected tissue, but something deliberate, purposeful. When I lanced the swelling, what emerged was not merely pus and blood. I shall document this precisely, though my hands shake to write it. The infected matter seemed to wither of its own accord, and within it, I glimpsed what appeared to be minute, thread-like structures, twisting and coiling like tiny eels. Young Thomas expired within hours. His father begged me to examine the body, convinced some curse had befallen his son. I agreed, though I now wish I hadn't. The body's lymph nodes, when extracted, contained more of the strange fibers. Under my microscope, they appeared to be almost crystalline, with complex branches patterning unlike anything I encountered in my studies of the disease. I have reserved several samples. God forgive me, but I must understand what this is. 15th of May, 1665. 3 more cases today, all showing the same peculiar characteristics. The fibers appear in every sample I examine. They seem to grow more complex, more organized with each passing day. I began to sketch their patterns, though I fear my drawings do not do justice to their bizarre intricacy. My colleague, Dr. Edmund Halsey, believes I'm allowing fear and exhaustion to cloud my judgment. He claims I'm seeing patterns where none exist. that these are merely the typical signs of the bubonic plague, but he hasn't observed them under the microscope as I have. He hasn't seen them move. I must document something else, though I hesitate to commit it to paper. The infected seem to share a common behavior in their final hours. They speak of visions, not the usual fevered hallucinations, but specific, constant images. They describe vast networks of tunnels branching endlessly beneath the earth. They whisper about something moving through these passages, something ancient that has been waiting. I tell myself these are merely ravings of dying minds, yet each patient describes the same scenes, down to the smallest detail. How can this be? 20th of May, 1665. I've made a terrible discovery. The samples I've observed, they've changed. The fibers have grown more numerous, forming intricate patterns that seem almost like writing in a language I cannot read. When I examine them, I feel a curious sensation, as if something is attempting to communicate through these bizarre structures. More disturbing still are the rat. London has always been plagued with them, but their behavior has become increasingly erratic. They gather in large groups, moving with an unnatural coordination. Yesterday, I observed a group of them in my laboratory, clustered around the cabinet where I keep my samples. They seem to be listening for something. I've begun to experience strange dreams. I see the tunnels my patients describe, endless passages that seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Sometimes I hear whispers in languages that have never been spoken by human tongues. I tell myself this is merely the result of exhaustion and stress, but deep down, I know better. 25th of May, 1665. The infection rate is growing exponentially, but that is not what truly terrifies me. It's the patterns. They're everywhere now. In the spread of the disease through the city, in the way the rats move through the streets, in the very arrangement of the bodies we collect each morning. Everything follows the same branching structures I first observed in those tissue samples. I started mapping these patterns, and what emerges is impossible to ignore. The disease itself isn't spreading randomly. It's creating something, building something, using us as its medium. Dr. Halsey visited again today. He seems troubled by my research, especially my maps and drawings. He suggested I take some time to rest, mentioned that many physicians have been driven to madness by horrors we witness. But his eyes lingered too long on my samples. I noticed his hands trembling as he spoke. After he left, I discovered several of my samples were missing. 1st of June, 1665. I can no longer sleep. The dreams have become too intense, too real. In them, I walk through those endless tunnels, following the branching patterns that have become so familiar. But now I understand what they are, a root system, spreading through the very foundation of our city. And at the center of it all, something waits. Something that has been growing, feeding, repairing. The pattern infection, when mapped across London, creates a perfect replica of the structures I've observed in my samples. We're not dealing with a mere disease. We're dealing with something that thinks, that plans, that has been waiting in Earth since long before humans walked upon it. I've discovered references in ancient texts to similar outbreaks throughout history. The Black Death wasn't the first manifestation of this entity. It has merged again and again, each time growing more complex, more organized, learning from each attempt. Today I visited Whitmore's again. The entire family is now infected, but they're not dying, they're changing. The fibrous growths have spread throughout their bodies, visible beneath the skin like dark rivers. They speak in unison now, describing the same visions I see in my dreams. They told me it's almost ready, that soon it will be complete. I must do something, but who would believe me? How can I explain what we call the plague as merely the visible portion of something far larger, far older, far more terrifying than we could ever imagine? 3rd of June, 1665. Dr. Halsey came to my house tonight, wide-eyed and rambling. He had taken my samples to study them himself to prove me wrong. Instead, he found exactly what I had described, but he went further in his experiment than I had dared. He claimed to have decoded the patterns, to have understood the message they contain. What he told me cannot be true, must not be true. But he explains everything, the consistent visions, the coordinated behavior of the infested, the precision patterns of the disease's spread. We are not dealing with a plague at all. We're dealing with something that's been waiting beneath our feet for millennia, slowly building itself using human bodies as raw material. The fibers we observed are not symptoms of the disease, they are its true form. A vast network that connects all the infested into a single growing organism. And now, after centuries of preparation, it's finally ready to... The entry ends abruptly here, the pen having skirted across the page in a jagged line. 4th of June, 1665. Write this in haste. They are coming for me. I can hear them in the streets below. Not just the rats now, but the infected themselves, moving with the same horrible coordination. Dr. Helson is with them. I saw him through my window, his skin rippling with those familiar patterns. I've hidden my research as best I can. This journal will be with my sister in Yorkshire, along with some instructions that it should be preserved but never read. Some knowledge is too dangerous. The patterns are complete. The network is fully formed. Whatever has been growing beneath London is ready to emerge, to transform from an invisible web into something far more terrible. I understand now why the infected didn't die, why they changed instead. They were never meant to die. They were meant to become part of it. And now, I hear them on the stairs. The rats came first, hundreds of them, their eyes gleaming with an intelligence that should not exist in such creatures. Behind them I hear the shuffling steps of the infested. Whoever finds this journal, burn it. Burn it and forget everything you read. Some things should remain buried. Some knowledge should stay hidden. The patterns are everywhere now. Once you begin to see them, you can never stop. They're in the very fabric of our world, waiting to be activated, waiting to spread, waiting to... The writing ends here, replaced by a series of intricate, branching patterns drawn in what appears to be dried blood. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just the ravings of a man driven mad by the horrors of plague. But as I set it down, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on my wrist, arrested against the pages, was a small, dark mark. When I looked closer, I could see thin, thread-like lines begin to spread beneath my skin, forming familiar branching patterns. I spent the next 3 days convincing myself the mark on my wrist was nothing, a trick of the light. perhaps an allergic reaction to the old leather binding, but on the fourth morning, I could no longer deny what I was seeing. The pattern had spread halfway up my forearm, dark lines branching beneath my skin like tiny roots. The medical training made it impossible to ignore the implications. The branching patterns followed my lymphatic system perfectly, tracing paths between my lymph nodes that I memorized in anatomy class. But there was something else, something that sent ice through my veins. The pattern wasn't just following my lymphatic system, it was extending it, creating new pathways that shouldn't exist. I returned to Theodora's house, desperate to find anything else that might explain what was happening to me. This time, I searched the attic methodically, checking every box, every corner. Behind a false panel on the wall, I found a metal strongbox. Inside were more documents, letters, hospital records, and most importantly, a series of correspondence between my great-aunt and someone named Professor Helena Blackwood, dated 1973. 15th of September, 1943. Dear Theodora, I must thank you for sending me Aldrich's journal. As a last practicing physician in the Blackwood line, I've long since suspected our family connected to the Great Plague went deeper than historical record suggests. Your discovery confirms my worst fears. I spent the last 20 years studying unusual disease patterns across Europe, focusing particularly on the incidence that mirrors the 1665 outbreak. What I found is deeply troubling. The branching patterns Aldrich documented have appeared repeatedly throughout history, always in isolated incidents that were quickly covered up or dismissed as medical curiosities. Enclosed are my notes from a case in Prague, 1928. A young girl presented with what appeared to be severe lymphobic inflammation. Within days, similar cases appeared throughout her neighborhood. The attending physicians documented branching patterns identical to those of Aldrich's drawings. But here's what truly terrifies me. He also documented instances of simultaneous movement among the infected. 37 patients, spread across 3 hospitals, all turned their heads at exactly the same moment to look in the same direction, all blinking in perfect unison. The outbreak was contained only when the entire neighborhood was quarantined and dealt with. The official records listed as a tragic fire. That's not all. I found references to similar incidences dating back to ancient Rome. They called it Morbius radicus, the root disease. The symptoms are always the same. The branching patterns, the coordinated behavior, the whispered descriptions of vast underground networks. I believe what Elric encountered was an isolated incident. It was merely one emergence of something that has been with us throughout human history. Something that uses disease as a mechanism for, I hesitate to use the word, but I can think of no other that fits, colonization. Your loving cousin, Helena. There were more letters, but what caught my eye was a folder of medical photographs paper clipped to the next page. They were from various time periods, starting with grainy images from the 1920s and progressing to clear, more recent shots. Each showed the same thing. Patterns with distinctive branch patterns visible beneath their skin. The most recent photos were from a small outbreak in northern England in 1981. The patterns were identical to what was now spreading up my arm. But it was the last item in the box that truly shook me. A modern medical report dated just 3 years ago from a laboratory in London. Confidential. Project root analyst of tissue sample recovered from 1665. Preservation reference, Blackwood collection. DNA sequence has revealed anomalous structures within preserved lymph node tissue. Branching filaments appear to be composed of previously unknown organic material with several impossible characteristics. 1. The sample remains metabolically active despite 350 years plus of preservation. 2. Filaments demonstrate ability to spontaneously organize into complex patterns. 3. When placed in proximity, separate samples display synchronous behavior. 4. Electron microscope reveals structures resembling neural networks. 5. Sample emits low-frequency electromagnetic pulse at regular intervals. Note: after 72 hours of observation, samples show signs of renewed growth. All testing suspended by orders of department chair. Samples sealed in containment unit pending review. Update: containment unit compromised. Nature of compromise unknown. Samples missing. Investigation ongoing. Final note: project terminated. All records to be sealed. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely read the last page. A handwritten note from my great aunt Theodora. To whoever finds this, I'm the last of the Blackwood line to serve as guardian of these records. Our family has carried this burden since 1665. Watching, waiting, documenting every reoccurrence. We thought we could contain it by keeping the knowledge limited to our bloodline. We were wrong. 3 years ago, everything changed. The pattern began appearing again, but different this time, more advanced. The laboratory breach was no accident. It's growing, evolving. The network is rebuilding itself using our modern understanding of genetics and neural networks to create something far more sophisticated than Aldrich encountered. If you're reading this, you've likely already seen the signs. The marks will have started small, a branching pattern that follows your lymphatic system. Soon you'll begin to notice other changes, moments of lost time, dreams of tunnels and roots. The sensation of being connected to something vast and patient and hungry. There's so much more you need to know about the ancient texts Helena found, about what really happened in Prague, about the true purpose of the patterns, but most importantly, about how they can be stopped. I've hidden the information separately. You'll find it when you're ready. When the patterns have spread enough for you to understand what you're truly dealing with. Look for the box marked with the root pattern, but be careful. Others be looking for it too, others who are already part of the network. Theodora. I sat down the paper and rolled up my sleeve. The pattern now reached my shoulder, and as I watched, I swore I saw them pulse, ever so slightly, in rhythm with my heartbeat. But something else had changed too. Where before the marks had been random, now they seemed to form a distinct shape, letters almost. And I could read them. I knew I should have been terrified, should have gone to the hospital, called someone, done something. But all I could think about was finding the other box, about learning the truth, about understanding what I was becoming. Because somewhere deep in my mind, in a place I hadn't even known existed until the patterns reached it, I could feel them, all of them. Everyone who had ever been touched by the root patterns, everyone who was part of the network. And they could feel me too. They were waiting for me to understand, to accept, to join. But first, I needed to find that box. Finding the second box was both easier and more disturbing than I anticipated. My body simply knew where to look. As I moved through Theodore's house, the pattern under my skin would pulse stronger or weaker, like some gruesome game of hot and cold. They led me to the cellar, to the section of the wall that looked identical to all the others, but I could feel it calling to me. Breaking through the plaster revealed a metal box, smaller than the first, marked with branching lines that perfectly matched the ones now covering most of my torso. Inside was a leather folder containing what appeared to be research notes, medical diagrams, and something that made my blood run cold. A series of brain tissue slides dated to 1928, labeled Prague specimens. But it was the modern-looking USB drive taped to the inside cover that caught my attention. Theodore had prepared for whoever would find this. My hands trembled as I plugged it into my laptop. The file was a video recording. Theodore's face appeared on screen, looking gaunt and tired. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 weeks before her death. If you're watching this, then the patterns have already started spreading across your skin. Don't bother trying to remove them. Surgery, burning, even amputation. The Bloodwood medical records document every attempt treatment over centuries. The patterns simply regrow, follow the same path, always rebuild the network. What I'm about to share with you is the accumulation of our family research, combined with modern medical analysts. Hannah was close to understanding it, but she died before making the final connection. I spent my life completing her work. The patterns aren't a disease. They're a communication system, a physical network connecting human hosts to something that's been growing beneath our feet for millennia. Each outbreak throughout history was an attempt to redefine this network, to make it more sophisticated, more efficient. The Prague incident in 1928 was the first time it achieved simultaneous neural synchronicity across multiple hosts. The tissue sample in the box are all that remain of that attempt. Under a microscope, you'll see that the branching patterns don't just follow the lymphatic system. They interface directly with neural tissue, creating new pathways between hosts. But here's what Helena didn't know, what we only recently discovered through electronic microscope and DNA analysis. The patterns aren't adding something to our bodies. They're activating something that was already there, dormant in our genetic code. Every human carries these latent structures. The patterns just wake them up. The video paused as Theodora had a coughing fit. When she continued, there was an urgency in her voice that hadn't been there. You need to understand, this isn't an invasion, it's an activation. Every plague, every outbreak, every instance of patterns appearing was just another attempt to switch us on, to activate what's been sleeping in our DNA since before we were human. The Blackwood family were more susceptible than most. Something in our genetic makeup make us ideal hosts for the initial stage of activation. That's why Aldrich was among the first to document
Our family has been connected to every major outbreak. I'm running out of time, so I'll tell you what you need to know most urgently. The patterns you've been seeing on your skin, they're not spreading randomly. They're forming specific sequences, like a code being written across your nervous system. Soon you'll start to understand this code. You'll begin to see how it connects to everything else. The tunnels beneath the cities, the way the disease spread, even the growth patterns of plants. There are others like you out there. Once the pattern spreads far enough, you'll be able to sense them. Some have been part of the network for years, generations even. They've learned to hide the marks, to blend in. They're watching, waiting for the network to grow large enough for... No, you're not ready for that. First, you need to see the rest of the Prague documents. They show what happened in later stages of activation. But more importantly, they show you what we discovered about the source, about what's been waiting all this time, growing beneath.
The video cut off abruptly. The next file was labeled Prague Stage 4 PDF. As I opened it, I noticed something odd. The patterns on my arm were moving, shifting to match the diagrams appearing on my screen. My body was learning, adapting, implementing the information in real time. The document began with a detailed medical report. Subject 23, Prague outbreak, Day 17, terminal stage observations. The branching patterns now cover 94% of the subject's neural tissue. Brain activity shows perfect synchronicity with all the other stage 4 subjects. Autonomous functions, heartbeat, breathing, occur in perfect unison across all connected hosts. New growth patterns observed in deeper brain tissue. Subjects report shared consciousness experience. Memory transfer between hosts confirmed through control testing. Most significant discovery: subjects no longer behave as individuals. They function as nodes in a larger neural network, each brain serving as a processing center for what appears to be a vastly larger consciousness. Critical observation. This network appears to extend beyond the human hosts. Soil samples from beneath Prague shows identical branching patterns extending at least 300 meters below ground. These underground structures pulse and sync with the hostess's neural activity. Update. Subjects have begun modification in their environment. Working in perfect coordination, they are constructing something in the hospital basement. The structure follows the same branching patterns observed in tissue samples. Purpose unknown. Final note. Military containment ordered after subjects began converting organic material into new growth medium. Method of conversion unknown. Entire facility to be sealed in. The rest of the document was heavily redacted, but the images remained. They showed cross-sections of human brain tissues with the familiar branching patterns. But these were different from the ones on my skin, more complex, more organized, like circuit diagrams drawn in living tissue. The last page contained a single photo, a massive underground chamber beneath the Prague hospital. The walls were covered in branching patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center was a partially constructed structure that resembled a human nervous system scaled up to architectural size. But what made me slam the laptop shut was the realization that I understood exactly what I was looking at. Not just understood, I could feel my body wanting to recreate it. The patterns under my skin were already starting to shift, to organize themselves in similar structures. Something warm trickled down my face. When I wiped it away, my hand came back red. Not blood, something darker. The tiny branching fibers visible within it. I could feel them trying to grow, to spread, to connect. The laptop screen flickered back to life on its own. A new document was opening. As I watched, text began appearing, written in the same branching patterns that covered my skin. You are ready to begin finding the others. The network must grow. The structure must be completed. Below my feet, I could feel vibrations in the earth, regular, rhythmic, like a vast heartbeat, or perhaps footsteps. I knew I should run, should burn the documents, destroy the evidence, try to stop the spread somehow. But instead, I found myself walking to the cellar door. Others were coming. I could feel them getting closer, their patterns pulsing in sync with mine. And deep beneath the earth, something ancient and patient stirred, ready to rise through its newly awakened network. The others arrived exactly as I knew they would, their footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization above me. I could feel their patterns resonating within mine, 5 distinct nodes in the growing network. As they descended the cellar stairs, I saw they appeared completely normal, wearing ordinary clothes, looking like anyone you might pass on the street. While I could see the faint line beneath their skin, pulsing in rhythm with my own. "Welcome, brother," said a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Shin. "We've been waiting for another Blackwood to join us. Your family always produces the strongest connections." I found myself answering in words that weren't entirely my own. The network requires a Blackwood to complete the next phase. "Yes," she smiled. "Just as it did in Prague. Just as it will again." But something wasn't right. As they moved closer, I noticed inconsistencies in their patterns. The branching structures beneath their skin weren't quite synchronized, showing subtle variations that couldn't have been possible in a true connected network. My medical training kicked in, and I began to analyze what I was seeing with critical detachment. "You're not part of the network," I said suddenly. "Not really. Your patterns, they're artificial." Dr. Chen's smile faltered. "Clever. Just like Theodora. She figured it out too, you know. Why do you think she had to be eliminated?" The truth hit me like a physical blow. You killed her. You're not connected to the network. You're trying to control it. "For decades, we've been trying to understand this phenomenon," another member of the group explained. "We attempted to artificially recreate the patterns, to tap into the network, but it never works properly without a true carrier, a Blackwood. Your family's genetic makeup is the key to interfacing with the deeper structure." The Prague incident wasn't a natural emergency, I realized. It was an experiment. You tried to force an activation. "An experiment that you're going to help us complete," Dr. Chen said. "Your connection to the network is genuine. With you, we can finally establish control over the entire system. They moved to grab me, but at that moment, something extraordinary happened. The patterns across my skin began to pulse with brilliant clarity. Information flooded my mind, not from them, but from something far older and vast. I finally understood what Eldrick had discovered, what Theodora had protected, and what Helena had died trying to prevent. The network wasn't meant to be controlled. It was meant to protect us. You don't understand what you're dealing with, I said, backing away. The patterns, the network, they're not a disease or a tool. They're an immune system. A defense mechanism echoed in our DNA millions of years ago, designed to activate when needed. Defense against what? Dr. Chen demanded. Deep beneath our feet, something shifted, the vibrations I felt earlier growing stronger. Against them, I whispered. The cellar floor cracked. Through the fissures, we could see deep channels lined with fossilized patterns, ancient neural pathways that had laid dormant for millennia. But between these patterns were other structures, alien geometrics, invasive growth patterns that bore no relations to the terrestrial biology. There's another network, I explained, the knowledge flowing through me from countless connected hosts across history. One that's been trying to establish itself since before humans existed. Every few centuries, it makes another attempt to take root, to spread through Earth's biosphere. The patterns we carry are our planet's natural defense, a way to detect and fight the invasion at a cellular level. That's impossible, one of them breathed. The Black Death, the Prague incident, every major outbreak, they weren't random. They were response attempts to incursions. The network activates when it detects the other trying to emerge. Every plague was actually an immune response. The ground shook more violently. Through the widening cracks, we could see something moving in the depths. Something with its own branching patterns, but wrong. Twisted and malformed like a cancer of reality itself. It's happening again, I said. That's why the network is waking up. That's why it needs a Blackwood. We're not carriers of the disease. We're antibodies. Dr. Chen raised a gun. This changes nothing. We'll find a way to control both networks. The power they represent. She never finished the sentence. The patterns under my skin flared, and suddenly I was connected not just to the network, but to every instance of its activation throughout history. I could feel Eldridge's presence, and Helena's, and Theodora's. All the Blackwoods who had served as nodes in the ancient defense system. Acting on instinct, guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge, I pressed my hands against the earth. The pattern flowed from my skin into the ground, spreading outwards in an exponentially growing web. When they met the alien structures, they encapsulated them, just as human antibodies surrounding hostile bacteria. The others tried to run, but their artificial patterns betrayed them. The network recognized them as compromised cells and responded accordingly. I watched in horror as their pseudo-patterns dissolved, taking their cellular structures with them. They collapsed in organic slurry, their bodies converting themselves into raw material for the network's growth. Over the next few hours, I felt the network expanding beneath London, seeking out and neutralizing pockets of alien pattern. Through my connection, I could sense similar responses activating worldwide as humanity's ancient defense system came fully online. 3 days later, the incursion was contained. The network began to go dormant again, but I knew it would never fully sleep. It needs active nods to maintain its vigilance, watchers to monitor for signs of the next attempted invasion. That's why I'm telling you this account, not as a warning, but as a training manual for others who might find themselves becoming part of the network. If you notice branching patterns spreading across your skin, don't fight it. Don't try to control it. Understand that you're part of something ancient and necessary, an immune system that spans continents and centuries. The patterns aren't a disease, they're an activation, a call to arms in a war most of humanity never notices, a war we've been fighting since before we were human. I still serve as an active gnome. The patterns are rarely visible now. They only show themselves when needed. I'm monitoring the network, watching for signs of new incursions. Sometimes I dream of deep places, of alien geometrics trying to take root in our reality. But I also feel the presence of other watchers, other nodes in humanity's immune system, standing ready to respond. We are the Earth's antibodies, and we are always watching. File note: found paperclip to this account. To the next nob who hears this, Dr. Chen's organization wasn't completely eliminated. They're still out there, still trying to artificially recreate the patterns. If you're hearing this, they've probably already noticed you. Be careful. Watch for people with almost perfect patterns. And remember, the network isn't good or evil. It simply is. Like any immune system, it exists to maintain balance, to protect the whole at the expense of compromised parts. The patterns are spreading again. The new incursion is beginning. If you're hearing this, you're probably already changing, becoming part of the defense. Welcome to the network, and good luck. We'll be watching for your signal. He groggily regained consciousness from his drug-induced nap as my hammer shattered the remnants of his pelvis. His screams of terror falling on deaf ears as I breathed in a deep sigh of relief, knowing that finally this would end his nightly visits to our daughter's room. The Lamb by Welcome to Nowhere. Everyone has their story. Your mother's memories of playing with a Ouija board when she was younger. Your father's recollection of hearing noises while camping in the woods with friends. Your siblings telling tales of goblins and ghouls that you knew deep down were only told to scare you. My dad had one before he passed about a terrifying, ugly demon who lived in our family mansion for 19 years. Jacob, my older brother. But all jokes aside, I'm here to talk about mine. It was around 2015, sometime in October. That year was particularly painful for my family, as my father had finally lost his battle with cancer that spring. He entrusted his estate with me, his only daughter, as I was set to take over the position in the family company. To make a long story short, though, I let my brother, Jacob, his girlfriend, Veronica, and dog, Zeus, room with me in the mansion. The last thing I wanted to do was sulk around, all alone in Dracula's castle before my own inevitable demise. Even though it was spacious and probably worth more than the planet itself, there was always something so off about it. Rather, something was so incredibly off about the surrounding town, Dark Hollow. Even though the town's name feels straight out of some Stephen King novel, there our state stood looming over the foggy, sleepy town perched upon the mountain, like a gargoyle prepared to feast on unsuspecting prey. It was particularly foggy driving up through the dense woods. Upon leaving the last few remnants of green foliage behind, the jagged curves and edges of the Carmen estate pierced through the melancholic moonlight. All was normal that night driving up to my childhood home. Jadis, the maid, and her husband, Josiah, our groundskeeper, were leaving for the night. Exiting my car, the air murmured in a silent waltz with the atmosphere fog engulfing the land. That silence, however, it felt visceral and insidious somehow. I had no tangible reason to why, but I couldn't help feeling as if I needed to hurry inside. While rummaging through my keys under the stone archway, I finally spotted it. Sitting on top the welcome mat laid a simple CD. It announced itself in red print, The Lamb. Curiosity crawled its way up to the forefront of my mind. That persistence led me to a decision I regret for the rest of my life. "What's that?" Veronica asked as I sauntered into the foyer. "It's the lamb," I teased while presenting the disc to Veronica and Jacob. "It's in front of the door when I got home. You guys didn't see who dropped it off?" "Nah, I didn't even know someone came today," Jacob admitted while Veronica nodded. My eyes fixated on the strange item now in my possession. "Hey, Jake, can you give me my laptop from the kitchen?" Veronica sat with me in the living room while Jacob wandered in with my laptop. I took the laptop from his hands and shoved the disc into the player. To be honest, I don't fully know what I expected. Maybe some awful local artist mixtape or something. But a video was the last thing in my mind for some reason. The laptop screen lit up with static remnants of what was obviously once a VHS tape. The crackling screen occasionally gave way to a viewable image of a nun playing acoustic guitar to a group of children. She kept singing the song, "Tonight You Belong to Me," a slightly creepy and retrospect oldie, almost as if she was on repeat. "What kind of fucking ass prank is this?" Jacob bellowed as Veronica and I laughed at his intrusion. But just before I ejected the CD and cleared my laptop of any potential viruses, Veronica noticed something. Her face. The nun in the video began to lose something about her. Almost like her essence of humanity seemed to disappear. The only way I could describe it nowadays is as if her face slowly started to become AI generated, moving in unnatural and impossible ways. She no longer sang her song, but some demented version of it, like it was stuck on a short loop somewhere in the beginning and reversed. That was about the time I removed the CD and tossed it in the garbage. The next couple of days were fairly normal, what with Jacob being away for work that week. Although I do recount the unexplainable bumping and knocking at night that I could only rationalize away as old mansions settling. Garbage day eventually came around, and off our trash went to the dump. That day definitely had a few more odd creaks around the mansion than normal, but nothing that rang any alarm bells. It was roughly around 2 o'clock in the morning when I felt Veronica nudge me awake. "Get up," she hurriedly whispered while tugging my arm. "What?" Before I could even move, she all but yanked me out of bed. "Where's the gun?" What do you need a gun for?" My eyes finally adjusted to the pitch black, her eyes staring back at me, displaying only primal fear. "There's someone in my room." It felt like my heart just ceased, like there was a giant cavity where it should have been. I quietly grabbed the handgun from my nightstand and wandered out into the musky void of the hallway. The moonlight was no longer melancholic as it slithered through the window panes, its malicious tendrils creating unholy shapes out of the things in the dark. We silently reached her room, and I slowly grabbed the handle. Each crashing creak of her door sent chills down my spine, alerting my brain of some impending doom. Her room was as silent as a crypt, but in no way did it feel as lifeless as one. Veronica flipped the light switch on, and we scoured her room for anyone who might have been there. Nothing. She sighed out of relief as we left her room, but before I could even turn to face her, something crawled its way through the still air of the mansion's winding corridors. Creak. I hauled ass downstairs towards the noise, making my way through the twisted and oblique hallways, gun in hand. Veronica and I finally stopped in the kitchen, staring intently at the now wide-open back door. Sitting there on the kitchen island was a simple, small disc. A lamb. Veronica got on the phone with the police as I closed and locked the back door. We turned on every light in that damn mansion and watched cartoons in the downstairs living room while waiting for the cops. The officers must have arrived 20 or so minutes later. We greeted Officer Reynolds, a pale man who looked like he did bodybuilding on the side, and Officer Carmichael, a friendly woman with dark skin. Reynolds and Carmichael did their rounds through the mansion, finding nothing. I remember Officer Carmichael talking to us while Officer Reynolds seemed to fixate on something in the backyard. Officer Reynolds told the three of us they would look outside while Carmichael continued taking our statements. It must have only been about 20 seconds until all three of us jumped at the sound of Reynolds slamming the back door. He walked into view visibly shaken, with his skin even paler than before. "We need to leave," he uttered to Carmichael. And just like that, the two of them left us alone within this god-forsaken house. Needless to say, Veronica slept in my bed that night with Zeus. Have you ever just felt like someone's watching you, even no one's there? That's what the next day was like. Constant eyes peering from every shadow in that damn mansion. It was only made worse by Zeus's newfound interest in vents and closets. He'd give them his little sniff-spections and then just stare. Even the allure of treats couldn't break him from whatever was entrancing him. That day, I tried going about routine as best I could. I cleaned the east wing of the mansion with Jadis, cleaned the music room and locked it up, made a late breakfast, took Zeus outside, locked the music room up, watched TV, and then locked the music room up. That day was also accompanied by the occasional banging at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Always in threes. Jacob's going to be gone an extra 3 days, Veronica alerted while I closed the music room door for what seemed like the 10th time that day. You told him about last night's little spook, right? Yeah, and of course he thinks we just spooked each other being alone. She giggled, but I could still see terror in her eyes. You're welcome to crash in my room for the time being. The house was already eerie enough as prior to the lamb showing up. A mansion that felt as old as time itself. The architecture twisted and turned as its cavernous hallways felt like they led to endless voids of shadow. The foyer opened like a castle into a dark unknown as the chandeliers leered overhead. Those open, cavernous rooms carried the echoes of those 3 knocks as the clock struck midnight. Veronica peeked up from the ottoman she was lounging on, her nose no longer buried in the Brandon Sanderson novel she was reading. We stared at each other long enough to communicate without a single word spoken. Who the hell was at our door at this time of night? She lunged from her seat and ran towards the nightstand, grabbing the handgun. I clutched on to the bat from my closet, and we both wandered through the jagged halls of murky black. The both of us quietly crept across the carpeted landing of the grand staircase and traversed down into the foyer. The front doors loomed before us, their haunting windows gazing upon us both like prey. But the strange part is how nothing stood outside in the misty moonlight. Nothing was at our door. I should have called the cops again as a precaution. Yet I felt silly for entertaining that idea with nothing being at the mansion. Victoria huffed as the shape of her white nightgown fluttered back up the staircase. We followed suit. We were back within the dim marmalade light of my bedroom within a matter of seconds. Should we call a psychic? Veronica rubbed her hands together as worry plastered her freckled face. I meandered over to the vanity. Vague stained the underside of my eyes. Don't tell Jacob. He's so going to make fun of us. Knock. 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 I felt the blood freeze under my skin. Veronica stared at me with her crazed panic seeping into her eyes. It wasn't at the front door this time. It was at my bedroom door. My fingers ached from the frost that was now enveloping them. Zeus stood and stalked towards the bedroom door, the hair down his back sticking straight up like spines. I slowly stood from the vanity with the bat as Veronica raised the handgun. My trembling hands threw the door open as Veronica took aim out into the nothingness of the mansion's vast hallways. The hallways lingered with emptiness, but the presence from the night before persisted. I don't fully know what it was, but both of us had the feeling that the door needed to be shut and we need not speak of what just happened. Something was playing with us, or was it taunting us? Either way, giving the attention it sought would only made it more active. We simply tried our best to sleep. Every howl of wind outside woke me. Chairs morphed into things in the dark corners of my room, and every snap of the house settling echoed like footsteps down the hallway just outside. The next morning, I went with Jadis and cleaned the west wing. I put my books back on the shelves, replaced the tablecloth in the dining room, vacuumed the game room, and put my books back on their shelves again. Night eventually rolled around, and I said my goodbye to Jadis and Joseph. The foyer fell silent as I glided my way to the staircase and wandered through the twisted galleries of my family portraits. The shapes tucked away within the maroon wallpaper formed dancing like spiral leading back to my nightly safe haven. Veronica slept, her auburn hair peeking from the duvet. The comfort of the person being there left to a swift whirl of sleep. Night crept on until something stirred me from my dreams, pausing the floor outside my bedroom and jogging to the other end of the hall. I quietly maneuvered from under the sheets and tiptoed to my door. I questioned myself what I was doing, but the unmistakable click of a dog's collar emanated through the hallway. My hand moved without thought, unlatching my door. I tried my best to peer down the hallway, but couldn't make anything out in the pitch black. I looked like a total cliché as I grabbed the electric lantern from atop my dresser and slowly wandered down the passage in my blue robe. I finally managed to reach the corner of the hall and gaze down at the end. Pawing at Victoria and Jacob's door was Zeus, his little claws dragging on the door as if desperate to escape the darkness of the mansion's hallways. Psst, Zeus, I loudly whispered in a desperate bid for his attention, my voice bouncing off the mahogany walls. Zeus lunged his head back to look at me in the moonlight. Something was extremely off about the movement, almost as if he didn't know his own strength, breaking his neck to look for me. His eyes pierced through the insidious darkness, just staring at me. He finally stood up and turned his body around to face me. That's when I noticed what looked like foam spewing from its mouth in the shadows. Zeus, come here, I worried whispered at him. His voyeuristic gaze was lured away from my presence, drifting towards the deep black hallway behind me. That's when I heard the pitter-patter of paws and the clicking of a dog collar sulk behind me as Zeus and Veronica emerged from the hallway. "What are you doing, Amy?" she asked. I froze, looking at Zeus, who had arrived with her now, standing at my side and peering down the corridor. I couldn't respond to her. I could only point at the other dog lurking at the edge of the shadows across the hall. Veronica's eyes went wide as she noticed the creature within our mansion. It began to lurch forward as if just learning how to walk. Its broken walls faded into shadows of the hallway where the moonlight couldn't reach. Zeus let out a deep growl as the creature merged into the murky shadows. We could only stand there as still as the dying air until the crackling made itself known. My eyes ignited with fear as the crackling source conjured into view. Brokenly lunging down the hallway was the twisted, unearthly silhouette of what should have been a person. Its arms extended before it with disturbing cracking as its spine and head slithered into unnatural motions. Veronica hurled Zeus into her arms, sprinting down the hallway with me in tow. A rage of crawling tore through the hall as I tumbled down the stairs after Veronica. We stumbled down the curving corridor until we made it to the grand staircase. Upon reaching our exit, that creature let out its sickening rage, known with one final wail ripping through the foyer. We stumbled out of that house and into my car, leaving that mansion behind in a crazed hysteria. We ended up at a motel running on nothing but pure, unadulterated fear. That night was accompanied by paranoid bouts and lack of sleep. Our week was spent slowly going insane, locked away within a single dingy motel room. The only thing either of us could think about was Jacob's return. That day couldn't inch closer in our minds if we tried. On the day he arrived, we called Easter Linklater, a local medium. After hearing our story, she promised to escort us back to the mansion. The state of that damn building when we met up with that sweet old woman was disturbing. Claw marks down the hallways, paint scratched off the wooden doors. Every single door burst open, and the lamb blaring through my laptop speakers, its haunting, reversing song slinking down the mansion corridors. It goes without saying what the source of the haunting was, and the medium left with the lamb secretly tucked in her bag. I don't know if she still has that cursed disc with her all these years later, or if it made its way into someone else's life. I can only thank her for moving it from ours. But on that day, Veronica and I both learned that disc's true intentions. Jacob's car was parked in the driveway, but he was nowhere to be seen. To this day, he remains a missing person, a sacrificial lamb. Veronica and I paid for our lives with his. Regret is an unbearable thing, a torture no one should be burdened with. Its crushing weight is only starred off by the hopes that he is somewhere better than our father. Whoever owns that disc now, do not Play it. The baby 3-year-old's back had been crying for 2 straight hours as we cruised over the Atlantic, and all I could do was close my eyes and wish desperately that the rest of the flight would be silent. None of us could even scream as one by one each of the engines ground to a stop and silence finally enveloped the plane. Vampirithus by BloodySpaghetti. The old one brought his grandchild to the seaside cave on a dreadful, stormy winter night. This cave was special because a god had taken residence there, according to legend. The master of the oceans in a corporeal form. A cruel and bestial thing, as dark and vicious as the depths themselves, fickle and turbulent as the seas at heart. An abyssal predator concealing his lust for destruction and chaos under an anthropomorphic facade crafted by his swarms of tentacled appendages. No one had seen the god himself, merely a statue placed there by the old one all those years ago. None dared question the validity of the tales, for the seas were treacherous, and that was enough to prove his existence. Standing before the statue of this divinity, the old one placed a clawed hand on his grandchild's shoulder, asking the youth, "My lamb, are you ready to become the savior of our world?" The little child could only nod in acceptance. He knew his destiny was one of thankless greatness. He also knew the road to his purpose in life was full of unimaginable suffering. Year after year, he watched the old one repeat the same ritual with his 6 siblings. Again and again, he watched his brothers and sisters save the universe from the wrath of their terrible lord. Good fortune blessed their family with a duty, a truly wonderful duty to the world. By 13 years of age, the boy knew he wasn't long for this world. All his siblings who had reached that age had to be offered as a willing sacrifice to the Lord. An innocent life was to be given away to salvage the world. "If so, let us save this world, my beautiful lamb," proclaimed the old one with a wide grin on his face. Tightly gripping his cane, he swung it at the boy, hitting him hard across the face. The child fell onto the rocky surface below, spitting blood and crying out in pain. "Did you just moan?" the old man berated. "Even your 2 sisters not moan like that." His hand raised again into the air. A thunderclap echoed across the cave as the cane struck flesh again. Then again and again, each blow harder than the one before, each crack of the wooden crane almost loud enough to silence the agonizing cries of torment rumbling across the cave. "Who would have thought that you, the last of my seed, the one who was supposed to be perfect, would be the weakest one of all?" The old one sneered, beating into his grandchild repeatedly with a sadistic hatred, guiding each blow in a remarkable precision meant to prolong the torture for as long as humanly possible. The boy, curled up in a fetal position, could barely hear himself think over the repeated waves of ache washing over his body. There was no point in protesting his innocence. There was no point in even uttering any syllables. He knew his body was no longer his own. It now belonged to the gods and their priest, his grandfather. He wanted to defend his assigned adulthood. He could no longer control his mouth or throat. Nothing was his in this world anymore. Nothing but an onslaught of indescribable pain. Finally satisfied with the ritualistic abuse he inflicted, the old one, covered in sweat and blood and frothing at the mouth like a rabid animal, collapsed onto his grandchild, turning the youthful husk, now covered in black and blue with stains of red all over, onto its back. The old one picked up a sharp stone from the ground and slammed it hard into the child's chest with an ecstatic glee. He slammed the stone again and again until the flesh and the bone caved in on itself, leaving a gap wide enough to push his hand inside the child. "Ah, there it is, the source of all my joy," the animal cried out. Its hand slid into the boy's chest. The youth weakly coughed, barely hanging on to life. He could hardly tell apart his monstrous grandfather from the surrounding darkness and cold. Everything turned even dimmer once the bloody hand came out of his chest again. The monster held out its hand in triumph, clutching the child's yet beating heart. Blood from the exposed organ dripped onto the youth's pale lips as everything vanished into the void, even the bizarrely satisfying smirk on his grandfather's face. The filicide of his last remaining grandchild had yet to satisfy his hunger for vile and pain. The demise of the one he had forced to behold as he snuffed the light from the eyes of their kin repeatedly did not satisfy his thirst for the obscene. Still hungering for more, the subhuman mortal shoved the little heart into his throat, swallowing it whole. The taste of human flesh further enticed his madness, forcing him to sink his yellow, rotting teeth into the infantile's carcass. Intoxicated with the fairest properties of his preferred wine, the old beast failed to notice as the ground shook violently beneath him. His tongue lapped the marrow out of the shattered thigh bone when the statue of his beloved god collapsed onto him, crushing his lower half and exposing his crimes. Countless little bones lay hidden inside the rubble. The vampire's pleas for help went unanswered as he withered under the weight of his creation. The cannibalistic beast was at the mercy of the heavens, but his god knew no kindness. He prayed between sheep-like bleats of anguish for a quick end. He begged for a piece of the cave to crush him to death once the ground shook again. But no such salvation would come. Tears streamed down his sunken features as the waves rose with boiling fury, for he knew his god had abandoned him. The old one desperately attempted to escape his punishment by throwing a stone at the cave ceiling, hoping it would fall on his head, killing him. And yet the forces above kept casting the stone away until it was too late. And the vengeful wrath of the gods brought down a deluge to pull the old ghoul and his blasphemous temple into the bottom of the abyss and away from sight. The father of the sweetest, most beautiful girl in town told me to have her back home from our date by 9 p.m. sharp. He never specified how much of her, though. The Puppeteer by Kahlil Worrell. Sarah Mitchell had always considered her husband, Agent David Mitchell, to be a man of order, intellect, and reason. His world was one of clear-cut facts, analyzed evidence, and unshakable logic. There was a comfort in that, in the way he could always separate emotion from investigation, shield them from the chaos his work often entailed. So, when she discovered an unmarked file tucked away in his office drawer one evening, a file he had never mentioned, she was intrigued. The file's surface was worn, the manila edges frayed as though it had passed through countless hands before finding its way to her. The label, in faded black ink, read, Re-101-The Puppeteer. It was a title that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine, though she could not yet explain why. Curiosity tugged at her like a child pulling on a sleeve, and Sarah, usually cautious, couldn't resist. She opened the folder. At first glance, it looked like just any other case file. Testimonies, photographs, surveillance reports. Nothing she hadn't seen David shift through countless times before. Yet something was different. A palpable heaviness filled the air as her eyes began scanning the contents. The first document was a brief report on a nameless victim, the identification redacted. What struck Sarah immediately was the way the incident was described. The victim had discovered an old photograph in a forgotten trunk in the attic of their childhood home. In the faded sepia image, a man stood with a puppet dangling from strings in his hand. But the puppet was not what had disturbed them. It was the man. His face was smudged, indistinct blur, as though someone had intentionally obscured it from view. It was the kind of blur that didn't make sense in an old photograph. The face wasn't out of focus, it was deliberately hidden, as if a dark cloud of ink had seeped into the paper itself, making the figure seem both part of the image and not. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. What had begun as a simple discovery quickly descended into a walking nightmare. The nameless victim had reported that the photograph seemed to change every time they looked at it. At first, it was subtle, just a shift in the light or the puppet's angle. But soon, the puppet appeared to move on its own, its position different each time they returned to the image. Then came the hallucinations. Dark, distorted figures seen in every corner of their vision, voices in the dead of night, whispers they couldn't quite decipher. And the dreams of strings attaching to their limbs, pulling them in unnatural, jerking movements, as though they had become a marionette in the hands of some unseen master. The report ended abruptly. No conclusion, no final notes, just a single cryptic sentence. Victim is no longer responsive. Sarah's fingers trembled as she flipped the page. Her eyes found the next entry, another victim, a young woman this time. Similar circumstances. She had found a drawing of a puppet, half torn and crumpled inside an old book she purchased at a flea market. Like the first victim, it began with strange occurrences, items in her apartment shifting positions, shadows that didn't belong to anyone, and always the puppet. Its twisted wooden limbs and painted eyes staring, unblinking. The nightmares came next. The woman had described the sensation of being controlled, her body moving against her will. She awoke with bruises around her wrists and ankles, deep purple marks that resembled the impressions of tight pulling strings. As Sarah read, her chest tightened. This was no ordinary case. It was as though the entry, whatever it was, thrived on more than just fear. It fed on control, on the act of manipulating its victims until they were no longer their own. Each case followed the same eerie pattern. First contact was an image, whether a photograph, drawing, or even a sculpture, triggering the descent. And once the victim was touched by the puppeteer's influence, there was no escape. Sarah felt a growing unease settling in her stomach. The room had become noticeably colder. She glanced at the window. It was closed. She hadn't noticed before how still the house was. No hum of the refrigerator, no distant murmur of the TV. Nothing but the sound of her own shallow breathing. She reached the last few pages of the file. One final report caught her attention. This victim was different. Not just a random bystander, but an investigator. A seasoned agent working for a covert agency known as the APE, the Apocalypse Prevention Enterprise. The agent's testimony was more detailed than the others, filled with critical observations. They had been assigned to investigate the origins of the puppeteer case after several unexplained disappearances. The agent's notes were meticulous, charting their own mental unraveling as they dug deeper. They had obtained a photograph, much like the others, and described feeling drawn to it, as if something beyond their understanding had compelled them to stare. Soon, they too began to suffer the symptoms: hallucinations, insomnia, the feeling of being watched by something unseen. But unlike the others, they had one final observation. The entity is not bound to the image itself. It transcends it. It enters through the mind. Once you see it, once you acknowledge its existence, it knows you. Sarah's pulse raced. The words felt like a warning, meant for anyone foolish enough to read too far. Yet, she couldn't stop. Her eyes flickered down the page, hungry for more answers, for something that would explain the strange dread now gripping her. The report ended with the agent's disappearance. No trace of them was ever found. Just as Sarah was about to close the file, something slipped from between the pages, a photograph. Her heart lurched. It was a picture of the puppeteer. She stared at it, transfixed. The man stood in the shadows, holding the puppet in one hand, its limp wooden limbs hanging lifeless. But just like in the other reports, the man's face was a smudged blur. She felt the room shift, as though the very walls were pulled inwards, enclosing her in a tightening grip. The temperature plummeted further, her breath now visible in the air. Suddenly, a sensation crawled up her spine, a cold, creeping awareness that she was no longer alone. Sarah's eyes darted to the edge of the room, to the corners where the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally thick. The photograph fell from her hands, landing face up on the floor. In the silence, the ticking of the clock grew deafening, each second pounding in her ears. She bent down to pick up the photograph, but hesitated. Something was wrong. The puppet. It had moved. Its head was now turned ever so slightly, looking directly at her. Sarah's breath hitched. She jerked upwards, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. Her instinct was to flee, to leave the file, the photograph, the room, everything. But her legs refused to move. Her mind whirled. Had she seen it? Really seen it move? Then she remembered the warning. She glanced at the file's cover again. This time, the words in bold at the top seemed to scream to her. Do not open without official APE protective eyewear. Her stomach dropped. It was too late. She had opened it, she had seen it, and now it had seen her. The room dimmed as the shadows lengthened, closing in, and Sarah felt the unmistakable pull of invisible strings tightening around her wrist. She wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't understand why my husband's hands were so shaky while serving me another glass. But his eyes only widened when I drank the glass full of bleach again, then asked for more. And now the stories have come to an end. If you're still awake, well, I hope you fall asleep shortly. And the sounds that you hear in the background are going to take center stage for no more than 30 minutes to help you fall asleep or stay asleep. But if you are awake and want to hear more stories, I do have playlists for that as well. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.